We've been talking about the V2 a little bit in several of the lessons, and I thought that I would talk a little bit about what the V2 is and where it came from, and then we'll talk about its capabilities a little bit. The V2 was created in the 1940s. It was created by the Germans in the 1940s during World War II. It was never intended to take things to space at all. The only thing that it was really intended to do was to deliver bombs without airplanes. In World War II, Germany was running out of pilots, and so they really wanted to be able to bomb places like London without having to have trained pilots. And so they came up with the idea of having a rocket do that. And so they did all of this development on the V2 so they could deliver bombs to faraway places without airplanes. They had to do a lot of development on the V2. It was a huge undertaking to develop the V2, and we'll talk about all the new technologies that they had to develop to make this work in the history part. The last time we talked about the rocket equation, we used the V2 as an example to determine how fast or how much delta V we could get from the V2. So let's go over that again really quickly. So the dry mass of the V2 is about 4,000 kilograms. That's without fuel or anything. It's about 4,000 kilograms in mass. The wet mass is about 12,805 kilograms. So there's about 8,800 kilograms of fuel in the V2. The exhaust velocity, remember, it was only about 2,000 meters per second because it was the first rocket. When we run that through the rocket equation, we get a maximum velocity that's about 2,358 meters per second. Okay, so what does that mean? If we launched the V2 horizontally, we just shoot it horizontally, it wouldn't make a lot of sense because gravity would just pull it straight down. If we launch the V2 vertically, it would just go straight up and then it would come right back down, right where you launched it. And that's not a good thing. So the V2 was launched at an angle. And so when it launched at an angle, and then when it landed at an angle. So how far would the V2 go? Well, so we can do a bunch of math to figure out how that would work. And we can use the kinematic equations to actually do that. So if we assume a 45-degree angle, which basically is equal horizontal and equal vertical speeds, we can run it through some equations, and we can get that the vertical speed is equal to the horizontal speed, which is 1,667 meters per second. Now, in order to calculate how far it would go, we actually have to calculate how high it would go first. All right. And so to do that, we calculate the time, which is the velocity, the vertical velocity divided by Earth's gravitational acceleration, which is slowing it down the entire way. So it starts off going very fast, and then it slows and slows and slows. It eventually reaches zero, and then it accelerates back down. And you can calculate that time to go from 1,667 meters per second to zero just by dividing the number 1,667 divided by 10 meters per second squared, which is the acceleration due to Earth. And you come up with 166.7 seconds. The V2 would basically take about 3 minutes to go from the ground up to its maximum altitude, and then it would take about 3 minutes to come back down. All right, so the total flight time was 333 seconds, which is about 5.5 minutes. It would take about 5.5 minutes to fly up and then down. Okay, so then what we do, we just solve for the vertical stuff. And we know that because it's going forward for 333 seconds and we have the velocity of its horizontal speed, we can calculate the trajectory, or how far it travels, by taking its horizontal velocity multiplied by the time. So that's 1,667 meters per second times 333 seconds, which is equal to about 556 kilometers. So in theory, a V2 rocket could go about 556 kilometers. But in reality, it only went about 200 kilometers in horizontal distance. And the reason for that is because of drag. All of our equations don't account for drag because it's really hard to actually account for this drag or air resistance. And so what you can do is you can calculate sort of the theoretical distance that it could travel, and then you actually launch one and you see like, oh, didn't quite go that far. And why? Well, it's because as it's traveling, drag is slowing it down. And so the velocity that it's actually feeling is significantly less. It slows down all the time because of drag. And so it can't go in reality as far as you would expect when you just do the theoretical calculations. Okay, in summary, the V2 was the first modern rocket. It was invented during World War II by the Germans, and it could go a pretty far distance. Using the rocket equation in the equations of motion, we can estimate how far it would actually go, but those are only approximations. And that's because there is air resistance, which messes things up a fair bit. And so in actuality, what the Germans did is that they actually calculated approximately how far it would go using these equations. And then they started launching some to figure out how far it would actually go in reality because of air resistance. We can do this all using computers now. So we could actually program in a rocket and see what the drag how the drag affects the flight of the rocket, and we could calculate these things very precisely. But when we're just solving these very simple equations, we can't do that. And so the difference between theory and reality can sometimes be a fair bit. But what we do is we basically use these equations to approximate how things work. And then we use computers to fine-tune that and figure out how they actually work. So thank you very much.